looking forward to hearing about the after-action report and our Hurricane Florence as he's working to do the after-action throughout the state to have a good document to talk about the successes, any failures, and how we can make our state better. So, Chief Jones.
Thank you. And so we put it in the description for this little program, and I'm going to reiterate it, that this isn't really an after-action review. We're still in the process of conducting all the after-action reviews, and we've been doing face-to-face interviews as well as sent out surveys, and so it's a process. And when you see how big the operation was, you'll kind of understand why it's taken a while to get the after-action review done. But in an hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to try to describe a 30-day operation. So just understand, I've got a lot of slides and tried to do a lot of graphics that kind of represent mostly our concept of operations, planning, and that sort of stuff that went into what ended up being the largest activation and deployment in South Carolina history, both for EMD. It's the longest EMD has ever been stood up at OpCon 3 or higher. They were stood up from, they started moving from OpCon 5 on September the 6th down to 4, and they went back to OpCon 1 on October the 8th. So over a month that EMD was stood up at a level higher than OpCon 5, which is normal operations. It's the longest deployment, and our first time really deploying essentially as a Type 1 team for our USAR team in state. They were deployed for 21 days. At one point in time, all of our regional CSAR teams were deployed and in play, with the exception of Myrtle Beach, who was kind of in play in their own backyard. So again, in an hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to try to give you an overview, and that's the way I'll describe it. If you want to know more details, I got tons of them, so catch up with me afterwards, or maybe there'll be an opportunity that we can present a little bit more in-depth overview of our search and rescue operations. I am going to concentrate, although I'll have some numbers for you about the fire suppression side of mobilization. I'm really going to focus on the search and rescue side, which involved the most planning. Essentially, with the fire suppression side, if you asked for suppression equipment, we sent it to you through mobilization, but then it was kind of handed off to the locals to run. It really didn't take a whole lot more coordination from us as much as it did from the search and rescue perspective. So Hurricane Florence. We had a lot of one-liners from Hurricane Florence because Hurricane Florence kept changing in intensity from tropical storm to Category 4 back to tropical storm. It's going to make landfall as a Cat 4. It's going to make landfall as a Cat 3, 2, 1. We adopted a lot of one-liners. Go with the flow was probably the most popular one. With our planning, we'll just go with the flow. As the rainfall forecast started coming, we decided we needed to be fluid about our decision making. But you can see kind of the history of the storm track as well as its intensity there as it went from a tropical depression through tropical storm right to a Cat 4 and then kind of died back down, sped back up. And so our planning kind of went along with what the storm was doing. So on September the 6th, EMD sent out a warning order to all the CERT, the State Emergency Response Team. That's the folks that man all the ESFs, the emergency support functions. And basically came out with this planning matrix. Most of the planning at EMD revolves around the time till the evacuation decision's made and evacuation order is given and starts being executed. So a lot of our decision-making timelines really gear our focus around not so much landfall as much as evacuation. And the reason being is if you want to get to the coast, you've got to do it before they start reversing traffic. And so in terms of pre-staging, if we wanted to get things forward prior to lane reversals, we had to work a little bit ahead of the curve. And so you can see the concept of operations and decision-making timeline that EMD had given us had us making staging decisions and EMAC decisions on or about September the 9th. We actually had made the EMAC request a day earlier than that, September the 8th. Our fear was our concept was when we were making those EMAC requests, we were preparing for a Category 4 landfall. Now in the emergency management world, you always plan for one category higher than what they're forecasting. So while they were forecasting Category 4, we're planning for a Category 5. And we were planning Category 5 landfall at that forecast timeline that they were giving us at that time. So we kind of backed up about 24 hours our EMAC decisions and request for what we anticipated the need would be. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And then it's how do we get resources forward? And so we started planning pre-staging and bases of operations and forward operating bases to have basically a fleet of quick reaction resources backed up by a base of operations or several bases of operations that would have more boats and more people that could backfill. And then you can see it all goes all the way down to the anticipated time frame at that point for tropical storm force winds was Wednesday night. Ultimately, it ended up being Friday morning. So here's September the 8th, that's Saturday. We actually sent out a warning order to all the fire chiefs, to Task Force 1, the regional task force, on Friday. And the reason we did that, and that's several days ahead, is we're going into a weekend. And our concern was folks that aren't in the office may not get office email over the weekend. So we sent out that warning order that was basically start rostering your resources, start considering what resources you may be able to provide in terms of boats, engine companies, personnel, whatever. Start doing that on Friday and do that through the weekend, anticipating that on Monday we're going to start pulling the trigger on asking you to send help. So that was the forecast track. On Saturday, it was forecast to make landfall. The cone of uncertainty was all the way from the southernmost portion of our coast all the way up to the southernmost portion of the Virginia coast and Category 4 storm at landfall. So we were planning for a Cat 5. So our concept of operations was this. EMD divides South Carolina into 4 conglomerates. You have 3 coastal conglomerates and then a western conglomerate. And it's basically, a lot of that's how you have evacuation zones, but EMD makes a lot of their decisions based on these conglomerates. So our concept of operations for, again, we're planning for a Category 5 storm, was to bring in 12 Type 2 swiftwater rescue teams. That would give us 4 per coastal conglomerate. 12 Type 2 CSAR teams, again, 4 per coastal conglomerate. And the idea was to try to push 3 into each conglomerate and reserve 1 back in Columbia to backfill. 3 Type 1 USAR teams through EMAC, so these would be other state teams like ours, non-FEMA teams. 1 Type 2 IST, which we did embed with our USAR operations and firefighter mobilization. And then we also requested 4 Type 1 FEMA teams, Type 1 FEMA USAR teams. And that sounds like a lot, but when you're looking at the potential for a Category 5 storm that could hit our southern conglomerate and literally affect the whole state, when you look at what North Carolina actually received, we weren't asking for much. That seems like a lot, but that wasn't as much. The cost associated with these is pretty significant. Those 4 FEMA USAR teams alone were $7.2 million. A lot of times you don't think about that, and you don't want cost to become a factor in what you're asking for, but all of that comes with a price tag. So Sunday, EMD the SEOC went to OPCON 3, which is our trigger point from a state fire perspective to start manning the SEOC and the ESF 49 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until things spin back down. So we had already broadcast our EMAC request. You can see this is our staffing schedule. So in the SEOC, and we're going to adjust this a little bit after this year, each shift would consist of either myself or Nathan Ellis as the ESF 9 lead, a SEOC coordinator, and those are 2 deep, and we would stagger. It would always either be myself or Nathan and then one of our SEOC coordinators. And then we have a 3 platoon system, and they work 12 on, usually it's at like 14 on and 24 off. So Dennis Ray, our superintendent, is a team lead for one of those teams. Doug Spinks in the back is another team lead for one of those teams. And so we have an ESF 9 team lead. We have a resource liaison, and essentially that person is working Palmetto. So if your department puts in a resource request, that's the person that sees it first. And once it comes to us from logistics. and then decides how we're going to fill it, or shoots it out to Ken to decide how we're going to fill it. An administrative person and documentation person, that person is really they're kind of a runner. We need a map for that. We need more paper for this. And then we have an IT person from LLR that's on call 24, that entire or 12-hour shift. There's just some pictures of us working in the SEOC. This is the first year we moved to a new room. We're not in the big room. If you've ever been in the SEOC, we're not in that big room anymore. We've actually moved out to another room. And in addition to our staff manning ESF 49, we also have a representative every shift from forestry because they are part of ESF 4. Once a federal declaration is declared, we have representatives from Title 10, which is our federal assets, our non-FEMA, this is our Department of Defense federal assets. We also have FEMA representatives in that room, and so that room gets pretty crowded pretty quick. But we do a lot of our initial planning through that. And then once we actually get into operations, a lot of the operational planning kind of switches back to the USAR building, and then we're just kind of doing the strategic level, and they're handling the tactical planning. So on September the 9th, this was a scenario EMD gave us. Again, we planned for one category higher than what's being forecasted. And the worst case scenario, or the most likely worst case scenario that EMD was preparing for, is that kind of orange, since we're in the upstate, orange line kind of in the middle, which would be a high impact landfall somewhere between Charleston and Georgetown. And so this was the planning scenario that they gave us. And so we started building what we anticipated. This is really before the fire departments, the local counties, started asking for stuff. We're having to anticipate what they may ask for and go ahead and get it on the way. So the cone of uncertainty gets a little narrower on Monday, September the 10th, as well as the intensity forecast drops a little bit. We're still going to have a Category 4 storm just off our coast, which is a little unnerving. And then we were asked on September 11th to conceptually develop a plan for how we would conduct wide area search in this entire portion that's kind of hashed out in green. So essentially, Horry, portion of Marion, and Georgetown County. We were asked, this is still days before landfall, we want you to develop an organized search plan for how you will coordinate search and rescue from a wind damaged area. They anticipated the most wind damage would be in that red hashed area, and then the water issue would be greater than 10 inches in the blue hashed area. And so our planning team got started on what does search look like? How do we account for everybody within those areas? And that's essentially what they asked us to develop. Then Wednesday the 12th, again, the cone gets a little bit narrower. The forecast intensity at landfall gets a little bit less, but the rain forecast begins to scare everybody. We're looking at localized areas in coastal North Carolina, 40 inches plus is what the forecast is. So September the 12th, again, we're a couple days before landfall. These are the resources we had either in South Carolina or en route. That's significant. Our concept of operations was, again, the quick reaction forces at smaller forward operating bases, and then a large contingency of both USAR, collapse, and swiftwater capabilities at bigger operating bases. So we had Greenville's Type 2 CSAR in Clarendon County, Columbia's Type 2 CSAR, their regional team was staging there in Columbia because we weren't sure at that point how much water is Columbia going to get. So they weren't quite ready to release them. Hilton Head, of course, we're still looking at a coastal event. It wouldn't take but a little bit of a jog to the south, and Hilton Head could have been, or the Beaufort County, that Task Force 4 could have been affected. So they staged in Hilton Head. We had Greenville's ERT, their swiftwater assets, also in Clarendon at the Weldon Auditorium. We were able to house a couple of swiftwater teams in the old Sumter Fire Department headquarters. They had just built a new headquarters, so they had living quarters, they had base space, shower facilities, all those sorts of things. And then Summerville and Berkeley offered to house some stuff forward. Usually when we pre-stage, we want to try to be at least 60 miles, ideally 60 miles from the coast. That's a bare minimum. FEMA, their rule of thumb is to not stage anything within 90 miles of the coast that may be impacted. So we kind of drew a line using I-95. We'd like to push things as close to I-95 as we can, but really not any closer than I-95. We were pushing it some with Summerville and Berkeley, but by that time they were kind of out of the cone of uncertainty, and we felt like that was a pretty safe place to put them. And then of course Task Force 1 and Hart staged at the USAR building there in Columbia. We had already brought in EMAC resources. We had 108 personnel and 24 boats from Tennessee. They were sleeping on cots in the Denny Auditorium. We had 36 personnel and 12 boats from Louisiana that were sleeping in the dorms, along with their Type 2 CSAR team sleeping in the dorms, and Louisiana's Type 2 IST that slept in the fire station and embedded with our folks. And then over at the Criminal Justice Academy, we had 4 Type 1 FEMA teams and a mission-ready package of water resources from Florida 2, all staged at the Criminal Justice Academy. So we tried to put all our federal resources on one campus and all of our state and EMAC resources at another campus. But in total, at that point, we were coordinating 705 rescue personnel, and that doesn't count suppression nor what the locals were doing. It's a big operation, and the storm hadn't even gotten here. This is just a graphic representation of where our forward operating bases were and where our bases of operations were. Storm track and intensity changes again, shifts a little bit north and decreases to a Cat 1 forecast Friday. And of course it makes landfall on Friday. This is just once we had pushed people forward, as we got closer and the cone of uncertainty got narrower, we pushed things into Lake City. Lake City gave us access to Highway 378 that took us to Conway. It gave us access to 52 that took us to Florence. We had groups in Florence that gave us access to 20 into Horry County. We had groups in Clarendon that gave us access to 521 and I-95 that would take us into Georgetown and could run us up towards Dillon. So we tried to, again, strategically pre-stage where they had major routes. And at this point, we had also given DOT a list of push priorities. Post-storm, these are the routes we have to have open because we have to be able to get into Horry, Marion, Dillon, Chesterfield. And so we had already given them those push priorities. Fortunately, wind really wasn't an issue for us, but the water certainly proved to be. And there you can see some of the actual rainfall totals, and I've got highlighted some of the South Carolina totals. The highest recorded official rainfall total was 23.63 inches in Loris, and you can see greater than 10 inches all the way over into Hartsville. Pawleys Island had almost 16 inches. Here's just a graphic representation of the same. So here's the issue, and I'll try to switch back and forth a little bit. All of that rain that essentially is just west of Wilmington falls into the Petey River Basin, which means not only are we going to deal with the water that's fallen in South Carolina, but all of the water that you see here has to come through South Carolina to get to the ocean. And at that point, we really don't know how bad this is going to be. I mean, they're making forecasts and trying to judge based on historical data from Matthew and the 2015 flood. But in the end, and Chief Tanner, you'll verify this, they said there's never been this much water in the Waccamaw River. We have no historical data that will tell us how bad this is going to be because there's never been this much water in the Waccamaw River. And so we really started planning that not only are we going to deal with flash flooding from our own water and some first stage river rise from our own water, but it's going to crest, start to go down, and then this slow-moving tidal wave is going to come in from North Carolina, and it's going to work its way to the Atlantic Ocean. And it's going to affect the PD, it's going to affect the Waccamaw, it's going to affect the Black River, the Lynch's River, all of these things. And of course, we know mostly affected the PD, the Little PD, and the Waccamaw. Those were really our troubled areas for the most part. So they started, the great thing about disaster intelligence, and EMD has stood up a disaster intelligence cell, and they've really done a really good job of this. You can see that they would run these models and put fictitious numbers, inches of water, inches of rain on the ground. Their models would, put it in the right watershed, add it to the right river. So they would build these different models with 10 to 20 inches of rain. And it would basically show us that, hey, Sunday and Monday, we're going to have a river rise and it's going to crest. But then later on next week, not like Sunday, Monday, and then 2 days later, a week later, we're going to have another crest that's going to be worse than the first one. And so again, that works into our planning and our coordination with local fire departments. When you ask for that much FEMA resources, they're going to send you an incident support team to support that. So the Red IST, which is a pretty big entity, was kind of hubbed, stationed in North Carolina, and they sent a branch. Hey, I just got an email apparently on my computer. They sent a branch of the Red IST to Columbia. They staged at the USAR building. And so we decided early on, once the IST got there, that we needed to have a unified command system. What we didn't want to happen is FEMA do their thing, and we do our thing, and we don't know what FEMA's doing, and they don't know what we're doing. So we had a meeting and decided we're gonna leverage the beast that is FEMA, the power, the manpower, the technology that they bring with us, to really have a unified command system. And so that's what we did. Jeff Strickland was the head of the Red IST branch that was in South Carolina. So he became the deputy IC. Ken moved into operations, and we married up someone from the FEMA IST in operations with him. And we had someone from South Carolina or Louisiana's IST married up to each position within FEMA's IST. It worked really well. We did planning together. Communication was unbelievable. All of our operational briefings were held together, and that worked really, really well. There you can just see some pictures of how crowded things were. This is if you're familiar with it, this is the classroom there at the day room at the USAR building. This is half of one of the classrooms across the hall. This is us giving a briefing to the Louisiana Task Force when they arrived in the cafeteria. So campus at the Fire Academy became pretty crowded. We had to make the decision to cancel classes statewide for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the PD area ain't interested in holding any classes right now, and we had to have the campus and all the personnel to support what was going to be a very long duration big incident. So in order to have a division of labor and provide command and control, we divided the state into divisions. And so Division 1 and 2 were the highest impact areas, and so they were much more condensed. Division 3 was going to get some water and anticipated some river flooding. Division 4 essentially shouldn't have, we weren't figuring that it would have any damage, and it didn't. So we had to break this down into more manageable pieces. And then you can see this is just a blown up representation as we moved people more and more forward into those areas, how many resources we had. And again, this doesn't account for the suppression resources, how many water rescue resources specifically we had in Darlington and Marlboro County and Dillon. We had from the Darlington County base of operations, we would hit Chesterfield and provide coverage in Chesterfield. And that was Division 1, and Division 1 had a Division 1 supervisor. At this point, that Division 1 supervisor and Division 2 supervisor was only from FEMA. And then Division 2, which was Florence, Marion, and Horry, you can see where all of the resources were staged at this point in the game. And that's, again, just a chart that shows you that. We're still managing a lot of people. Once we realized that the impact from the wind, we weren't really going to be dealing with collapsed structures. we released 2 of the FEMA USAR teams from South Carolina, and they went into North Carolina, and North Carolina needed them. We also released the Type 2 collapse team from Louisiana to go back to Louisiana. That was about 40 personnel. Logistically, that was a big relief for us because that was 40 people we weren't having to feed on campus. Those were dorm rooms that we could have back as we had people cycling in and out. So on the 17th, a couple days after landfall, that's what our forced laydown looked like. And the water kept rising. This is I think it was Bluff Road. I believe it was in Marion County on the 18th, and you can see the first line that was painted to here was 5 minutes difference. That's how fast the water was rising. Doesn't seem like much on a piece of asphalt, but that's pretty quick. And for Chief Tanner, we were tasked with something that South Carolina didn't have a plan for, and that's developing lily pads. And you ask, well, what's a lily pad? Well, it's exactly what you think it is. You pick up a bunch of people at a spot that's wet, you drop them off at a spot that's dry. That's what a lily pad is. Really, a lily pad is set up for when you have a lot of people that you have to do that for. So, you know, the search area that we were given the responsibility to develop a plan for had a population of over 250,000 people. So what if we've got an entire subdivision just outside of Litchfield that we've got to airlift people from? Where are we going to take them? How are we going to get them to a shelter? So a lily pad consists of a couple ambulances if there are injured folks, some coach buses, 45, 50 passenger buses that would transport people to a shelter. At the Myrtle Beach lily pad, we also had fuel. And then of course, keep in mind, these people are coming out of contaminated water. So you got to plan for how do you decon people before you put them in the ambulance? How do you decon them before you put them on this coach bus that's going to take them to a shelter? This kind of became the running joke. I mean, there were several times I called Chief Tanner on the phone. We talked probably 5, sometimes 10 times a day, and every now and then he would answer the phone, ribbit. The issue is that South Carolina had in their preliminary plans to implement lily pads, but there was no lily pad plan. So we had to build that. We're going to continue to have meetings because really once we drop them off at the lily pad, it's more of a mass care issue than it is a search and rescue issue. And so we feel like DHEC and DSS probably need to be involved a little bit more than they were. So this one's for you, Chief Tanner. We didn't really have to use them, thank goodness. So our folks that were assigned to lily pads, Anthony Simmons, you were one of them. Really, it was a lot of sit and wait. It was a lot of sit and wait and a lot of work for something that fortunately we didn't have to use. Again, the problem is the water kept coming. And this, I'll be honest with you, this frustrated FEMA because FEMA has all these gadgets. They can see when their folks are moving and when they're not. And FEMA's looking at their folks that are sitting, you know, on Scipio Lane in Horry County or North Myrtle Beach or down in Georgetown, and the guys haven't moved in 3 days. Why aren't they moving? Well, it's because the water's still coming. So you had this gap of almost a week, in some cases 10 days between this surge of activity when we're doing a lot of water rescues and we're waiting for the next tidal wave. And so do you let people go and bring them back? Are you going to get them back? So we held folks in place, and that frustrated folks, especially FEMA a little bit, in that they weren't moving, they weren't being active. And so that part of our after action review is being able to help provide some planning that would utilize their capabilities in that kind of downtime. But you can see the predictions that we were seeing is that the Lumber River crested on the 18th that day, but it was going to stay in major flood stage for another 9 days. Whereas you go further down, we hadn't even got to the problem yet. This is September the 18th. They're anticipating the Waccamaw at 17 is not going to crest for almost another week. And when it does crest, they were anticipating it to stay up another 10 days. So when the problem got there, it wasn't going to go away. And the reason being is it's kind of like a wash tub. Is the PD, the little PD, and the Waccamaw all meet. And so the PD and the little PD are going to drain first. And because of all of that water, that confluence of water, it was going to back up the Waccamaw, and the Waccamaw wasn't going to be able to drain until the PD dropped, and then the Waccamaw could drain. And so it was just a very, very complicated, long, drawn out mission. We made some adjustments. We realized that we needed to have South Carolina Division supervisors embedded with the FEMA Division supervisors. So we brought in Will Vinay and Brian Wagner. At this point, we had essentially created two divisions. Horry County was a division and Georgetown County was a division. All of our problems now were in those two counties. And so we didn't get away from a unified command, but FEMA wanted a little bit of separation of the hands-on on the ground. So we instituted our own division supervisors, and that's just what our organizational chart looked like on the 20th. That's the swing bridge there on the Intercoastal Waterway at Socastee. That was taken with one of the drones, I think, from Louisiana. Or maybe that's not the swing bridge. It's on the Intercoastal Waterway there. This is the result of the task we were given to develop a statewide search and rescue plan. So along with FEMA, Louisiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, we actually have now a South Carolina search and rescue guide. And we're going to put it on our website and make it available. We're going to do some training on it because this is available to every jurisdiction. Our goal would be is if you call state resources for help, we're going to say, here's a guide to put us all on the same page. And just like Chief Tanner did, you're going to decide you're going to adopt some of the rules of engagement and not others. So this guide shows that you can do marking for search and rescue. You can use paint, you can use stickers, or Chief Tanner's like, we don't want houses that aren't occupied to be visibly or noticeable to those riding by that they're not occupied. So ultimately we ended up using an app and marking that with an app, which we're going to implement statewide and in conjunction with some other states as well. But we now have the South Carolina Search and Rescue Guide. Disaster intelligence, man, I can't say enough about the power of knowing. I remember as a kid I used to watch G.I. Joe, and they would say, knowing is half the battle, right? That's the truth, and they have just so much information at our fingertips. So in part of our search and rescue plan, it was how do we coordinate this over a county the size of Horry? How do we give them tools to know how many houses are in this area? How do we know that, how do they account for what's going to be flooded and what's not going to be flooded? So one, we were able to use the Survey 123 app, which is a free app. We're going to continue to use that, provide some training on it. But then we were able, the Joint Disaster Intelligence Assessment Cell there at EMD was able to overlay the DNR models for what the inundation was forecast to be. And so you can actually see kind of the scale of colors here. These purple dots in the dark blue were going to be in 10 feet of water. And not only were they going to be in 10 feet of water, they were going to be in 10 feet of water for 10 days. So this tool, we were able to give to Horry County, and they could look at it and see in this grid, there are 423 structures that water is going to touch. And that gave them a tool that they could use to conduct their search plan or prioritize their search plan. And so they would basically assign grids to the teams and say, today we'd like for you to get grids 1 through 8. They would go through, check all the houses in grids 1 through 8 or all the houses that were being affected in grids 1 through 8 and be able to report back complete. But the duration of the event was probably the most challenging thing. I know I came and spoke to the Firefighters Association. I don't remember what the event was at this point in the game, but the fact that we supported in-state an operation as large and as long duration as we did, 21 days. A couple of our teams, 3 of our teams were deployed for 21 days straight. Not to mention what the locals were doing. They've been working all this time as well. We had to figure out, how do we keep people in the game as long as the local resources need them? And at that point, it looked like the local resources, and they did, we're going to need them through the first part of October. Keep in mind, we started this on September the 6th. The first crews from Task Force 1 reported to the USAR bid on September the 11th. We're talking now into the first part of October. They ain't been home. They ain't seen their families. They ain't been to work. They hadn't been back. Their fire department's missing them. So we had to figure out, how are we going to do this? And so we did that a couple of different ways, utilizing EMAC, asking for extensions for local resources, bringing in more FEMA resources. But my promise to Chief Tanner was, we're not going to leave you in a gap. We're going to do our best to have resources in place before we have to demobilize resources. And so that was certainly a challenge. And how do you coordinate that? How do you get a good transfer of information from teams that have been there for 3 weeks, and make sure that you get that transfer of intel and reconnaissance, in addition to bringing in the resources that you need? And ultimately, we were able to decrease the numbers. And that was very helpful. But we also ended up employing the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard had shallow water, but not swift water boat teams. At that point, we weren't really dealing with swift water. It was very, very slow moving water. Some of the positives, and I don't have enough slides to talk about the positives, but these are some of the things that I think stood out. First and foremost, I think it was a W in the win column for South Carolina. And I'll tell you the same thing I told our folks, is if we fail in this event, it's my fault. I mean, I'm the one that's going to get blamed, so it might as well be my fault, right? If we fail, it's my fault. If we win, it's your fault. And I think it was a W in the win column, from the local level to the state level, with the EMAC partners and with FEMA, because of you. The fire departments that supported it, again, Greenville, the Task Force 4, they were in play the whole time, not to mention Task Force 1. I can't say enough. I can't say enough about when your neighbors needed help. Not only did you send help, but you stayed in the game when you're tired, when you've been sleeping in a cot for 3 weeks, when you've been in a hot, dry suit all day long, when it's hot outside, in not nice stuff in the water. We were getting reports from, I think it was Columbia Swiftwater team, who was doing some recon at night in the Pawleys Island area, and they were talking about how many gators were in the water. So it was a challenging event, and I think the most positive thing was the discovery, and I guess the reassurance of the talent and the fortitude and the dedication of the South Carolina Fire Service to step up when it's needed. I think our unified command was a very positive thing. We worked well together. We've been in touch ever since. I talked with Jeff Rouse from FEMA probably once a week. We're constantly in touch with our friends from Louisiana. We're continuing to work with our friends from Louisiana. We've caught up with our friends from Tennessee, but unified command just worked. Communication, we were able to get, I know that it was a problem during Hurricane Matthew, but we were able to get a South Carolina mutual aid channel assigned to mobilization. Eventually we ended up with 2. Isn't that right, Matthew? We had SCMA 5 as well. Our Task Force 1 comms team, and I'm not just saying this because they're in the room, they did some amazing stuff. They created a communication system in places that there was no communication system, to the point they were putting towers up on hotels in downtown Myrtle Beach to create interoperability between the helicopters with HART and the folks on the ground. The comms bus was a hit. They were able to create networks and communications in Marion and Chesterfield County where it wasn't a sustainable resource when they got there. So kudos to the comms team. Y'all did a great job. They've even been training with HART and getting qualified on the hoist In fact, I think it was like the week before the storm hit, we lowered a repeater on the top of a mountain up in Oconee County and set up a communications network in the mountains where one didn't exist. So great job by the comms team. One of the things I stressed to our folks when we first got this thing kicked off is one, we're all on the same team. And for something this long and this big, you're going to get frustrated with each other. But keep in mind, we're all on the same team. We all have the same mission. We all want to accomplish the same thing in the end. Let's keep that in mind. But the other thing was, we can't communicate enough. We cannot communicate enough. I was on the phone with the fire chiefs in the affected counties several times a day because I wanted to make sure we were hearing from the horse's mouth how things were going on the ground. We would go out and meet the troops where they were working because we wanted to see and hear how things were going. We were talking constantly from the SEOC to Building 22. They were talking constantly. We were having 10 o'clock in the morning and at 9:15 every night, Chad would host a conference call with all the mobilization regional coordinators, with the division supervisors, with the firefighter mobilization committee members, just again to facilitate that communication and make sure everybody's on the same page. In the end, we didn't communicate enough. You would think, what else are you going to do? We did email updates and all that kind of stuff. We can still improve in communication. And we've already been talking about some different ways that we can improve, not so much the quantity of communication, but the quality of our communication. I think that's where we can make our most improvements. As the teams came in, they were provided a packet that had their 214 forms, which they would document daily what they were doing, contact information, comms plan. What do you do when you get to Horry County? Horry County had everybody checking into a central point. You would get an ID card that was your ticket to work in Horry County. You were given their comms plan, your radio was programmed, or you were given a programmed radio. All of that was in the packet that they got as they were being mobilized. And then we used the updated tasking order form. And that was positive because we had the proper documentation, but it's still manual. And that's another area that I think that we can improve is we're still doing manual tasking orders. We're still tracking stuff on spreadsheets. And technology the technology exists that we can do that better. The JDAC, the Joint Disaster Intelligence Assessment Cell, hands down one of the best things EMD has done in maybe history. I mean, it's phenomenal. The resources, they probably could have given us a lot more than what we even asked for. And then I know she's my boss, and I know this is being filmed, so hey boss, but the support that we got from the LLR director, she was involved. She didn't have to be, she didn't have to be at the SEOC. She didn't have to go out in the field. She didn't have to be. That's what she had me for, right? She was involved. She was in the SEOC almost every day, weekends, Sunday, night if she had to be. She was very involved and wanted to be very. She even dressed in task force BDUs. She's got her own task force uniform. We went out to the field. We met with Chief Tanner. We met with some of the other folks on the ground. We went to Marion and met with those folks where we had a big base of operations, went to check on them. They were actually kind of relieved to see me in Marion because a news reporter, a news team, TV news team had showed up just before I got there. And when I walked in, this is the picture, and you can see the look on his face. He was just on the phone with Chad or Sean going, hey man, there's a news reporter here, what do I do? Never mind, Jonathan just walked in the door. Chief, I need you to get on the TV. Yeah, I got this. But I just can't say enough about that kind of support. I mean, and it was to the point that when we did our team picture for the task force, when it was all said and done, that group shot, you know what I'm talking about. It's the one where you got the burning building in the background and everybody standing there, see you're laughing. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So we do the group shot with the task force too, and they invited her to come take a picture because she's truly part of the team. And I think if that's the one takeaway is the word team. It was truly a team effort from the local level to the state level to the statewide mutual aid or state to state mutual aid through EMAC and even at the federal level. But I do want to talk about some planned improvements, and believe it or not, I think I'm going to wrap up on time. I was a little bit worried. Some planned improvements. I told you technology exists, and we just hadn't figured out yet which technology to use. But we're gonna make this year, and hopefully before hurricane season, we're gonna find a firefighter mobilization tasking and accountability system that works for us. The ability, one of the things in one of the after action reviews with the county emergency managers I heard is they weren't real happy with the fact that the fire chiefs in their county sent help out of their county to someplace else and they didn't know about it. Well, I don't have time to call every county emergency manager, and maybe you don't either. So there's got to be a way through technology that when you deploy something, an email gets sent to your county emergency manager that keeps them in the loop. Again, it's not so much the quantity of our communication, it's the quality of our communication. And so we're actually demoing next week, I think, and we're going to be doing some tabletop exercises with a couple of systems that will not only give us the visibility that we're looking for, but give you as the sending fire chief or you as the receiving fire chief that same kind of visibility. Not only will you see the resource request, the tasking order, but you'll also see when your crew leaves, when your crew arrives on the scene, when they get demobbed, and when they get home. And so that's our goal, hopefully by this hurricane season. We got a lot of things we want to do by this hurricane season. I'll tell you, from my perspective, the thing that frustrated me the most were things that we could have had a checklist for or that could have been pre-planned. And we didn't have those things. Predetermined bases of operation. Taking care of people is complicated. Taking care of people is complicated. And one, because you're dealing with people, but two, there's a lot of logistics involved in that. You know, people will go a day without a shower, but you don't want to sleep next to a guy on a cot that's gone 5 days without a shower, you know? So figuring out how are you going to make sure that you're taking care of folks' hygiene? How are you going to feed us 705 people that we were responsible for? How are we making sure 705 people are getting fed over 7 counties? Fortunately, locals were able to take care of a lot of that for us, but we had to bring in mobile kitchens. We had to bring in shower trailers. What about laundry? You know, we issued 2 task force uniforms to Task Force 1. They were gone 21 days. What do you think those smelled like? You know, so we had to bring in laundry trailers. Those were all things, we didn't have a checklist for that. It would pop up, we'd put in a resource request, we'd figure out how to get it. But we can pre-plan bases of operation and forward operating bases in every county. And we can develop a checklist for what do those have to have? What's the criteria? How many people will it hold? Does it have shower facilities? Does it have kitchen facilities? And if not, this is how we can fill those in. The beauty of it is we've already identified some in Horry County because we've already used them. We've already identified some in Marion County, and the counties that we've already were gracious enough to host us. Base of operation and FOB checklist, forward operating base checklist. The checklists just make everything easy. If you've ever flown in a plane, you are thankful that the pilot uses a checklist, right? We should be doing the same thing, and so we're working on those kind of checklists to just make sure we got all the boxes filled. What was frustrating for me from the SEOC is I didn't know what the boxes were, let alone if they were filled. So we would move 100 people from point A to point B and then find out when they got to B that this point B wouldn't hold 100 people. Now what? Or when we got to point B, the people at point B didn't want us there. Okay, we got to figure that out. Troop movement checklists, that's another one of those checklists. You know, to move an engine company from one station to another ain't that big of a deal. To move 100 people, 6 tractor trailers, 18 boat trailers, it's a big deal. There's a lot of logistics involved. And troop movements, what makes it more complicated is when you're trying to do a reset in place troop movement, which means I want to get troops there before I release the troops that are already there to relieve them, but that place won't house them both at the same time. So timing bringing this group in, doing a handshake, a handoff, you know, passive command, so to speak, and get those folks out of there into some place they can sleep and clean up is challenging. So again, a troop movement checklist is something that we can pre-plan and go ahead and have in our back pocket. The good thing is, it's pretty much, these things are pretty much already developed because we had to develop them on the fly. This has been something that I've been preaching, and it was a glaring hole that was pretty obvious to me. We brought in the Louisiana IST. Of course, we married up to the FEMA Red IST. And IST stands for Incident Support Team. It's very similar to an All Hazards Incident Management Team, but it's very, and I've learned this word over the past few months, it's very USARian in nature. I didn't know USARian was a word, but it is. It's very USARian in nature, meaning it's got a lot, it's very heavily on USAR specialists, hazmat specialists. It's more focused on the USAR or the search and rescue world than kind of an all hazards. And I put State Fire IST down for a specific reason, is we're gonna need this in every event. And because we're gonna need this in every event, we can't be dependent upon where the storm's coming. One of our problems is, if it's coming to the southern coast, well, if it's coming to the South Carolina coast at all, there's not a coastal fire department that's really gonna let us have their people. So we can't be dependent on where's the storm going as to whether or not we get the help. So our plan is we're building this incident support team out of our full-time employees. It kind of hit me, state offices are closed, regional offices are closed, and for those that aren't working directly with USAR or aren't in the SEOC, they're sitting at home for 21 days. These people have fire service backgrounds, rescue backgrounds, paramedics, hazmat techs. I mean, we've got the talent within our full-time staff, and we're gonna build this primarily out of our full-time staff and then use volunteers, we've been talking with regional IMTs. How do we take what will be a type 2 IST and make it a type 1, which essentially gives us 24-hour operations? Or how do we utilize and leverage our regional teams or volunteers that wanna be part of the IST to be a force multiplier? So the State Fire IST, we're calling it the Palmetto IST. We already got a patch because logos are important. So that's that. We're working on that now. The next thing, and it ties in closely with the IST, is we worked really well with Louisiana. The Louisiana State Fire Marshal and I are good friends. He has the exact same responsibilities in a statewide emergency as I do. He's responsible for ESF 4 and 9. And so he actually came with his teams. He sat next to me in the SEOC. This is a guy that's been through Katrina. Can't tell you the value of being able to look to somebody and go, is this a good idea or not? Or somebody go, you're not thinking about this now, but I'm telling you 5 days from now, you're gonna be dealing with this. So put somebody on planning for it. In terms of planning, most of the time we think in our planning P, we're focused on the next operational period. What is very evident to me, and I know Chief Tanner and I have talked about this at length too, is that you gotta have your planning section that's looking at the next operational period, but you better have a whole nother group of people that's looking at 7 days from now. Because 7 days will be here before you know it. And EMAC folks are gonna have to be demobilized. They're gonna time out before you know it. Somebody's got to look past the next operational period, and you gotta have folks planning past that. Again, that IST is gonna be part of it. The IST, Ken loves this analogy. The hardest thing for me personally and professionally was to not be an operations chief during this event. That was my comfort zone, I was a special ops chief at Clarendon, and I've been the ops chief, so this was kind of my thing. I like doing this. And it was very easy for me to slide into that battalion chief role or that operations chief role and want to be operational, but I couldn't do that. So the problem is we didn't have the instrumentation for me to see clearly what was going on outside of the SEOC. So I equated to this, and it hit me on a bad flight back from Boston. We're up above the clouds of a pretty bad storm, and it's crystal clear. I can see forever in this airplane. And we're coming into Charleston, and the pilot's making his descent. You can't see below this nasty storm and these clouds, but he's gonna land in a very small, very specific spot very quickly. The difference is is the ground has instrumentation to know exactly what's going on in that plane. And the plane has instrumentation to know exactly where the ground is. And even though they can't see each other, all of that instrumentation exists so that each group knows exactly what's going on and they meet in the right place at the right time. And we lack that instrumentation, especially on an operation this big. But again, I think the IST becomes that instrumentation piece that keeps me from being the operations chief and keeps me at the strategic level, but allows me to know what's going on at the task and the tactical level. From the mobilization standpoint, I just want to leave you with this picture. The quantity of request and the size of the request for this thing was unbelievable. You know, typically our day-to-day mobilization is one phone call from a fire chief that says, I got a really big fire and I need this much help. And it's a few phone calls, a few emails, and some text messages, and we were able to get them the help. We had requests for 70 firefighters for a week. I can't remember how many engine companies, 24-hour shifts for a week that we had that were then sustained. Tanker strike teams for a week. I think they ended up being 2 weeks after the extension. The quantity, the number of individual requests was unbelievable, and the size of the request. I can remember calling Chief Tanner several times going, Chief, I don't know that we're going to get you this many people. And with the exception, I think, one big request, we filled them all. And when I say we, I mean we in this room, because it floored me. When Chad would send me an email and go, this request is full, I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Where do we get them from? But just the quantity of the influx of requests, you can see obviously a huge spike just pre-storm. And then this next one was 2 weeks later, when we're trying to figure out how do we continue to sustain this through the first part of October. So just in summary, some totals. South Carolina Task Force 1 deployed for 21 days. HART had helicopters operational 24/7 for the entire duration of the event, and they were housed starting out in McIntyre. Eventually they had helicopters in Charleston, they had helicopters at the Myrtle Beach Airport, the Florence Airport, and again in Columbia at McIntyre. We had, just from South Carolina numbers, we had 27 swiftwater rescue teams. Tremendous. 4 of the 5 type regional CSAR teams were deployed. Task Force 4 from the Beaufort County area and Task Force 6 from here in Greenville were deployed the whole time. Chief K and I were talking last night from Greenville. I'm like, he's like, we'll do it again if that's what it takes. To have, you think about it, 20 of your folks deployed for 21 days is tremendous. And then from a suppression standpoint, we had 50 different fire departments that filled requests for just suppression requests. Firefighters, engine companies, tanker strike teams or task force. 50 different fire departments answered the call, and more than 150 firefighters were mobilized outside of search and rescue just for firefighting needs. Unbelievable. This is a video that we produced, I guess it was about 14 or 15 days in.
That was actually operating back here. This is 13 days in the storm. We were originally in Marion, South Carolina. We got retasked down here to the Myrtle Beach area. This crew has been non-stop for 13 days, 24 hours a day, working, trying to save as many lives as we can and keep these neighborhoods, or at least keep the people out of these neighborhoods. So this crew, I can't thank enough. These guys are notorious for not stopping and keep going. So we just hope that people see that we are still out here, we're still working, the floodwaters are still here, and we'll keep going as long as they need us.
This is a picture. Is Charlie in the room? He could tell me exactly. I think this is either Pickens or Oconee County. There's a couple of folks from Oconee. Isn't that Oconee? Yeah. This was Oconee County after they had done a rescue, and actually you can see there's your survivor right there in the middle. Great job, and good gracious, they slept in the back of a Marion fire station. It was not the best of living conditions, and they were all on cots and had stinky, sweaty towels hanging everywhere. But man, they stuck with it in Oconee County, and I think Pickens did the same thing, maybe Anderson as well. They were constantly rotating people. They were like, we're going to keep people in the game as long as they have to be, and we'll just rotate them. We'll just figure it out. We'll keep people in play. This was our incident support team at our Search and Rescue Operations Center. We call SAROPS. It's made up of South Carolina folks, Louisiana folks, Tennessee folks, and the FEMA Red IST. I'll tell you, when FEMA comes in, they've got tractor trailers of technology that I'd never seen before. Unbelievable. Half the stuff we didn't use or know how to. And then this was a small group picture of Task Force 1 after the completion of the mission, a couple days afterwards when we had done our after action review. I started to put our Team Ori picture in there just for Chief Tanner as well, but I thought better of myself. So again, thank you. There's a lot more detail, and as we complete all of our after action reviews, we're going to produce an after action report, and there'll be opportunities to do additional presentations. But if you want to know more detail, just get with me, because I'll be happy to share it. A lot more stories to be told, but all in all, I just can't say enough about what you all did and in the storm and in the response to the storm. So thank you. Let's eat.